You've lived a great life and done well for yourself. But what mark will you leave on the world? How will you inspire future generations? Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand have helped thousands of people answer exactly those questions. If you've ever wondered, what will be my legacy? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Your Life, Your Legacy podcast. Now, here are your hosts, Stan and Katie Beth.
Welcome back to the Your Life, Your Legacy podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. Our guest today is the former national president and the current regional director of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Alex Otte. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So before we dive in, I do want to talk a lot about Mothers Against Drunk Driving and that organization. But there's a reason that you're actually really passionate about this cause and about ending impaired driving. So if you don't mind, would you take just a few minutes and tell us a little bit about your backstory and your history and how this has affected you personally?
Of course. So not many of us come to issues like this because we want to, unfortunately. A lot of us are brought here because something happened either to us or someone we love that kind of left us with no choice. And so that's my story as well. It was about 14 and a half years ago. I was sitting on a jet ski behind my dad's house on Lake Harrington in Danville, Kentucky. It was nothing out of the ordinary. I'd been on the water for years, had my boating license for years. The lake was in my dad's backyard. We were putting our family's boat in the water to make sure it would run as we had planned to visit another family for the July 4th holiday. My mom and brother got in our boat to drive it back to the dock about half mile by water. My dad took the truck back to the house, and I jumped on the jet ski to follow the boat and just make sure they made it back okay. Everyone made it back fine. Harrington is a very narrow lake, and so I was sitting about 40 yards across the lake from my mom and brother, waiting for them to dock the boat so that I could dock the jet ski and we could go up to the house for the evening. There was a 17-foot bass boat coming under a nearby bridge. Apparently, I gave my mom a thumbs up to let her know I saw him coming and I wasn't going to move. When you get your boating license, they teach you that if a boat's coming towards you, don't move or try to anticipate where they're going to go. Just stay where you are and wait for them to pass. And so I did. The boat was headed towards my mom and my brother at a speed of about 70 miles an hour. My mom screamed. He banked to the left and never straightened up. The boat hit me from the side, going over 60 miles an hour, threw me off the jet ski. The boat went up over the jet ski. I landed face down in the water, and the boat landed on top of my body. The propeller landed on both of my legs. I was face down in the water for 3.5 minutes. The man who ran me over was nearly 3 times the legal limit 2.5 hours after the crash. And to no fault of my own, this was my new life. I sustained an incredibly severe traumatic brain injury classified as shaken baby syndrome, where my brain shook inside my head and started bleeding in 4 places, and they were unable to make it stop. I shattered my jaw, so my face is entirely metal from here to here. I have 3 plates and 12 screws in my face. They did all of the surgery on my jaw from inside my mouth, which was incredible. As a 13-year-old girl, I don't have any scars on my face, but it also meant that for more than 11 years after the crash, I had 1 surgery a year on my jaw just to keep my teeth in. I broke my neck, broke my collarbone, lacerated my liver, shattered both of my femurs because when I was thrown off the jet ski, I was holding on so tightly with my legs. I don't remember, but presumably because I was scared, that I took the handlebars with me. If you've spent much time around a jet ski, you know it's all one piece and not supposed to come apart. So both of my femurs were shattered and unable to be put back together. I now have metal rods instead of bone in both of my thighs. When the boat landed on top of me, the propeller landed on both of my legs. My left leg was under the water just enough that it only required stitches, but my right leg was completely severed by the propeller. I was airlifted to the Level 1 Trauma Center at UK Hospital in Lexington, where I live, and was not expected to survive. I spent the first 4 days in a coma on my own, and they kept encouraging my family to call in more people to say goodbye, gave my parents very little hope. I remained in a medically induced coma for the remainder of a week, had 8 emergency surgeries in the first 7 days. I spent several weeks in the ICU, a week in rehab, 6 weeks in a neck brace, and 3.5 months in a wheelchair. And this is my life now. This wasn't something that I had any concept of. I always talk about July 1st of 2010 being the last day. That was the last day that I got to be oblivious. That was the last day that I was a kid and did not know that drinking and driving was such a problem. It was the last day that little girl lived a life. We talk a lot about, at MADD specifically, about people who are killed in drunk driving crashes. But we don't talk a lot about the people who are left to live with the impacts every single day for the rest of their life. And I knew that I don't know who that little girl would have grown up to be, but I know that I'm nothing like her. That life ended and this was a totally new one. And I'm grateful now for the life that I have. And my family, my husband, my parents do not love that I say I wouldn't change it if I could. But that's the way I feel because I don't know who that person would have been. However, that doesn't mean it's ever gotten any easier. Time does not heal all wounds. Nothing healed, it just gets different.
Absolutely. Such a powerful story. And it's so interesting. I first heard about Mothers Against Drunk Driving when I was probably a teenager in high school. It's a program that I had heard of. And of course, at that point, I wasn't a mother. I was the child having those conversations with my mother. Now, hearing your story on the flip side, I am a mother. I have 4 children, including a 16-year-old who just started driving. And so it's so interesting hearing your story and talking about Mothers Against Drunk Driving again on the flip side as a mom, because now I see that girl from 2010 as maybe my daughter or maybe one of my boys, and the heartache and the hardship. And so it's just a completely different perspective now. And so thank you for sharing your story. It's so powerful. I know that it's impacted a ton of people. And of course, obviously, it's worked out into a beautiful life for you. But having impaired drivers out there on the road is something that we want to avoid in every circumstance, because that little girl, her dreams were shattered that day. What was it like? Do you remember waking up after your accident? How long was that before you were really able to understand what had happened?
So I don't know how long. I don't remember exactly when I understood what happened. I know that because of my brain injury, shaken baby syndrome affects people in different ways. When most it happens to babies, they often die. They didn't know what was going to happen to a 13-year-old. And so for me, it results in a lot of short-term memory loss that I make dang sure you could never figure out if I didn't tell you. I live my life by post-it notes, and that's okay. But my dad was the one that told me. He wanted to be the one that told me what happened before I woke up and saw that I didn't have a leg. But my dad did have to tell me over and over and over, which I can only imagine as a parent now myself, what that was like for him at the same time. Recovery will never end. A lot of people ask, oh, how was recovery? What was recovery like? I will let you know when it's over. As I said, I had one surgery a year on my jaw for the first 11 years after my crash. I have no doubt that there will be more surgeries in my future. I don't have any scheduled right now, but it impacts every part of my life. For example, my daughter is a year old now. We kept her in our room until she physically did not fit in the bassinet anymore, because moving her into another room takes away my ability to comfort her at night. I have to put a leg on. I can't just jump up and run and get her the way that most parents can. So the impacts of that day have never and will never end and will never stop changing. And so while this last year with my daughter was a very tangible reminder that God can work and speak incredible good out of unspeakable tragedies, it's also been a reminder of everything that man continues to take away from me.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of organizations, or several, I should say, that are similar to Mothers Against Drunk Driving. What really drew you to Mothers Against Drunk Driving as an organization to commit your time and tell your story? What was it about MADD in particular that kind of drew your interest?
I think it's really that the goal of MADD is to meet people where they're at. And so in that way, my family was reached out to soon after the crash that said, hey, we'll be there to support you throughout this process. The only court appearance that I went to was the gentleman's arraignment. Other than that, my parents kind of handled it. I was a kid, so I didn't I wasn't too engaged in the court process. But I do remember someone from MADD being there and just saying, hey, if you need to talk, I'm here. And I rolled out of the arraignment in my wheelchair in a neck brace when he said, I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything wrong and she shouldn't have been on the water. And a woman bent down and said, honey, are you okay? And so that was really the first step. I very quickly after that realized that while it's not easy for me to talk about, and I don't think it ever will be, if I don't keep talking about it, it's going to keep happening. And MADD was the place that gave a 13-year-old kid an opportunity to be a part of the solution. And so in 2014, I was named one of MADD's national teen influencers. They requested 10 teenagers from across the country to come together and learn about the laws, learn about how we can be a part of preventing this. And so I was accepted to be a part of that, worked on some really important state legislation that while it would not have saved me, it would not have prevented my crash because it didn't have anything to do with boating, would change the culture. Worked on that pretty significantly in high school. It ended up being named the Advocate of the Year in DC in 2015 for that. Kind of just decided, I guess we'll keep this going. Did not intend on being national president. That was, to be honest, a job for older women that had lost their kid. It was not a job for me. So it was on my bucket list to be a part of MADD's board. And I applied to be on the board in college. I think I was 21 or 22. And they said, there was an individual who said, we're looking for an older, more professional board who's had more experience. And I said, okay, that's fine. And several years later, I got a call from one of those board members. And she said, if I'm crazy, you can hang up, but we think you should apply to be national president. And I said, I am quite several decades younger than the youngest national president. I haven't lost a child. You've never had a national president who has had an injury. I'll apply, but not going to happen. And here we are. So that it was a new look for MADD. It was a new look for me, but it's very much, I felt like I didn't have a choice. MADD really is the place that brings together individuals from all walks of life who have been impacted. And I hope that in the last several years, we've brought together more individuals who may not have felt welcome in the past. And so MADD has just been a home and an outlet for that.
I love that. And I know, Stan, I've stolen all the questions. I promise I'll let you jump in here in just a minute. But I just really appreciate the story and how you're using. I love kind of everything about it. So I like that you ended up being the national president of MADD, even not as a mother yet and as a young person. And I think it speaks to you that you were a victim of one of these incidents and then you're out there using that to change the world for good. And so I love that. I love that MADD selected you to be their leader. I think it's a great program. And for our listeners, I want to read off just a couple of statistics from the MADD website that I think to me, it felt jaw dropping. And so I hope this gets your attention as much as it did mine. 43.6% of fatally injured drivers tested positive for substances. And then in 2021, 13,384 people were killed in this type of incident. And of that, 4,300 were under 21 and 4,300 people under the age of 21 get killed from this every single year. And as a parent, that is shocking to me because that feels like an astronomically high number for such an easily avoidable situation. I've jumped in with that. Stan, I know you have questions for Alex. What do you have?
This is quite a remarkable story. And one of the things, Alex, about your story that I find particularly engaging is that the incident that resulted in your injury was not the result of an automobile. You know, we always think about drunk driving a car, but here this is about boating. And my sense is that there are a lot of people who understand that they can't drive a car under the influence of alcohol, but they don't really think they don't think the same way about it when they get behind the wheel of a boat. And so it seems to me that your being in this position with MADD really underscores that and perhaps opens the aperture on the whole conversation. Talk to me about that.
So there's really two things that I hope my term as national president and my continued legacy within MADD and elsewhere really brought attention to. Number one is that, yes, more than 13,000 people a year are being killed by drunk drivers. More than 300,000 people a year are being injured. And that's the statistic that's not on the website. That's the thing we don't talk about. But that's the people like me who wake up every morning and put a leg on, who don't get to forget, who don't get to walk away from it as if it never happened. And so I want to bring attention to that. And I want to continue to bring attention to that, that we as injured people are very underrepresented, but also on the side of boating under the influence. I want to underscore the fact that driving under the influence is driving under the influence. It does not matter and should not matter what mode of transportation you are on or in when you consume alcohol or other drugs and get behind the wheel. But unfortunately, from a state and federal law standpoint, we're not there. Not even all states are at 0.08 on the water. We still have one state in the country that is at 0.1, which is crazy because everyone is supposed to be 0.08 on the roadway. We have very few states that have made strides in aligning the penalties for BUI and DUI. You could have a person in most states, where I live included, who lost their license for driving under the influence of a vehicle so many times, but they can get in their boat and take off drunk because we don't have an alignment of penalties. But it's also a culture thing that is our issue, in that many years ago, you would have gotten behind the wheel of a car with a beer in your cup holder and no one would have thought a thing about it. Now, you would never watch someone drive away drunk and not do something or say something or even feel something. Even if you are not in a position to stop it, you're going to feel like that's wrong. But that doesn't happen for boating. You see people with a cooler on their boat and you don't think anything of it. You watch someone drive away on their boat after drinking and no one thinks anything of it. So it's a culture shift that we've had occur on the roadway that has not happened yet for the waterway.
So, Alex, let me say, I think there is a positive, I think, that has happened over the last, I want to say, 30 years or more. I think I'd shared with you before we started the recording here that I was involved a few decades ago on our governor's drunk driving task force, and the real shift that we were able to bring about is moving away from a subjective observational standard of intoxication to the blood alcohol test, which is just, like clean, clear, and cold, right? And so at that time, it was a 0.10 standard, but we had to fight for that. But when we succeeded, the the number of incidents involving drunk drivers really did go down, right? And then later, the standard was made tougher down to 0.08, right? And then and I haven't really kept up with it in the years since. I'm sure you have, but I think the standards have gotten tougher. So let me ask you, given where we are now, what other things could we do? We got people listening to this who know people, right? They can make phone calls, they can do things. What could we do? What could the people listening to this podcast do that could really authentically make a real difference in bringing about even more change in this space?
One significant thing that anyone can do, you don't have to be a police officer, or prosecutor, or legislator, or victim with a personal story, anyone can be involved in, is looking to MADD, victims of drunken drunk driving, organizations like ours, to see what they're supporting, what they're working towards. A prime example right now is the HALT Act. It is the Honoring the Abbas Family Legacy to Terminate Drunk Driving Act. This is federal legislation that I, along with many other victims and survivors, championed over the last several years. It was an incredible fight. But we got this legislation passed, got this signed into law by President Biden in 2021, really looked toward this legislation to make a significant change. But as with government, as with how everything is, takes time. And unfortunately, longer than we'd like.
What would that act do?
The HALT Act would put drunk driving or impaired driving prevention technology as standard equipment in all new vehicles. One thing that's really important to note is this is not an ignition interlock. An ignition interlock is something we support. It's a punitive measure for people who have already demonstrated their decision making and a choice to consume alcohol and get behind the wheel. But that's not what this is. We are not out to inconvenience the driver who's not doing anything wrong. None of us, myself included, I do not drink, want to get in a car and have to blow in something. None of us want to do that. That is not the goal here. The goal of the HALT Act is to use passive technology that's already in a lot of new cars today, such as automatic braking, lane departure warning, lane assist, cameras, anything like that, to prevent someone from driving impaired. The important thing is most of these monitoring technologies, there's two different types of technologies. Sorry, I'm kind of talking in circles about it. There's two different types of technologies. One is driver performance monitoring. What this is automatic braking, lane departure warning, lane assist. It monitors how an individual is actually operating the motor vehicle, the movements that a car is making. The other side of this is driver performance monitoring. An example of this could be a sensor in the start button or in the steering wheel that measures how much alcohol is in a person's sweat. It could be breath-based sensors. It could be cameras in the dash or in the rearview mirror to monitor a person's eye gaze, whether their eyes are closed for too long, looking down for too long, or things like that. We don't know what the technology decision is going to be. When the law was signed in November of 2021, it gave NHTSA 3 years to look at all of the available technologies and choose one or a combination of the available technologies to mandate in all new cars. That timeline was 3 years. And so we are quickly approaching that in November of this year. But after that, it gives car companies 2 to 3 years to ensure that the equipment is standard on all new cars. The difference here is we are not trying to get people. But at the same time, most of these technologies, if the monitoring technologies are chosen, which is not my decision, very much a NHTSA decision, but just looking at them, it seems that it will be at least some combination of a monitoring technology. That is not looking at BAC. That is looking at whether a person is safe to operate a vehicle. And the BAC legislation that we have all worked towards, that Mr. Miller worked towards, that we worked towards many years ago with 0.08, and other states have worked toward lowering further than that, is incredibly important because it does give that important number to look at. So it's not subjective. It is an objective standard to really remove that good old boy system that I think a lot of us experience in our states. But with that being said, there's a new thing every day. There's a new drug every day. There's a new anything. So people can be impaired at BACs far below 0.08. And so that's something we're concerned with now. And that's a reason that these monitoring technologies would really be looking for impairment.
Are there states that have done an exceptionally good job with this that provide an example that we could look at and model?
I don't know that there's always going to be pros and cons. I will say in terms of aligning the penalties for boating under the influence and driving under the influence, over the last 3 years, the state of Tennessee has made incredible strides. They have had some really good legislation. They're not a leader in that legislation yet, but I do think the legislation that has been put out is very objective and clean and really moves the needle forward in terms of holding people accountable. In addition, the HALT Act legislation is just really important because we know that this technology is available. We know that this technology is on lots of new cars. I have a family member who has this technology on her car. She can also afford to pay for all of the added safety features. And that's where we're at right now, is it's all available. It's all out there. It's keeping people safe, but it does two things. It makes safety a luxury of people that can afford it, which I don't know many people who can pay several extra $1,000s for a car. And also the people that genuinely need this technology on their vehicle because they're making this choice are never going to pay for it. Making it standard would make it something that they can't charge more for. You can't charge someone more to have a seatbelt in their car. And so that's the goal here. This is a rulemaking just like seatbelts, just like backup cameras. But unfortunately, we know that government rulemakings are often put off for a really long time. And we know that every day we wait to have something that fixes things, more people are going to be injured and killed.
Are there vested interests that are pushing back on this?
Absolutely. Specifically car companies.
Really? Okay.
Yes, specifically car companies, because right now they're making a ton of money. They're charging a lot for these safety packages. And what's devastating that most people don't know, and I wouldn't have known if I hadn't lived this life for a while, is because it's cheaper to make all cars in the same way. Most cars already have this technology and it's a software switch. So you're paying several $1,000s for them to turn it on, but they're making a lot of money to flip a switch. So there's a lot of pushback, primarily from the car companies. But if you do some research into other countries, they already have the technology. They're already advertising the technology because those countries require them to do so. Ours just doesn't at this time.
So what other countries would we look at to inspire us?
You should absolutely look at, it's the Euro NCAP and Volvo and Subaru. Volvo has an incredible video about what exactly their technology does. But if you talk to Volvo in the US, they don't think it's possible. They don't think we can do that anytime soon. Not going to happen. So it was quite a fight. And unfortunately, I had hoped the fight would be over when the president signed it, but it is not. So that's the biggest thing that people can do at this time, is to reach out to their legislators, talk to their friends and family, try to dispel some of these myths. I even have friends of mine that will reach out and say, why do you want everyone to have an ignition interlock in their car? Well, of course not. If you read it, that's not what we're doing. That's not what it is. And so just having conversations, dispel some of those myths. A lot of the articles will say that this technology essentially gives law enforcement a kill switch for your car. Law enforcement does not touch the legislation, nor do they touch the technology. So that's kind of some of the things that we hear when you've been so involved in this world are so ridiculous that it's like, I can't believe I have to fight you on this. But just to be educated on what the legislation is and why it's so important. We know that this would save more than 9,400 lives per year once it's fully implemented and the fleet has turned over and all those things. So that's going to take a lot of time. But that is the closest we've come to nearly eliminating drunk driving.
What happened to the guy that ran over you?
He was charged, it was his fourth DUI. He was charged $250, which is the minimum first time DUI offense, because Kentucky is a good old boy system. And he was sent home with the opportunity to reoffend, and he has many times.
Since your accident?
He has, yes. And I found that out because years later, after the crash, about 5 years later, I was doing a radio show with Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, who were the responding officers in my crash. And they asked if I was okay. And I said, I really just hope he learned from it. And they said, honey, he didn't. As of when I was about 18, I knew he had 7 DUIs total, and I'm 27. So I have no doubt there have been more. I just don't know how many. He will never be sorry. He still to this day thinks he didn't do anything wrong. Unfortunately, there was an 8-year-old boy in his boat who made a very difficult victim statement of what happened. It never bothered me what the drunk man or his drunk friend said, but that 8-year-old who was at the front of the boat and saw every bit of it, it did bother me. And I found out several years ago that his family has convinced him that I'm dead, so he'll never try to find me. I hope that at this time, he knows I'm on TV, I live in Central Kentucky, I go everywhere. But there may still be a young man out there that thinks he watched me die. And I struggle with that more so than I do the fact that Sammy Hackler will never be sorry.
What a story.
Absolutely. Okay, before we run out of time, Alex, if you could tell all of our listeners one thing that you have learned from this, one thing that you would like people to hear and take to heart, what would that be?
The one thing that I would like people to know in terms of the issue is think about the choices that you're making. Drinking and driving is not an accident. It's not a mistake. It's a choice, and it affects more than just you. In general, in life, I read a book one time that said, when bad things happen, the only thing you can do is the next right thing. And so in my life, that is what I have tried to do. It does not mean that there aren't days that I don't want to get out of bed because a man tried to kill me. But all you can do is the next right thing. And that comes into play with making the right choices and knowing that your choices affect other people.
Absolutely. Well, for all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. For more information on Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you can visit madd.org. You can also find the organization on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. And MADD has a lot of resources, including conversation starters, so you can have these conversations with your kids. And one day, hopefully, there will be no more victims. Alex, thank you again. And for all of our listeners, I hope that you will join us in striving to do the next right thing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Your Life, Your Legacy podcast with Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more about Stan and Katie Beth, go to pinnaclelegacylaw.com. You can also find links in the show notes.